For the past few years, Evil Empire and Motion Twin, the developers of Dead Cells, have been hinting at a figure in their game. One that had to have been important to the realm in its past, but remained unseen. The little clues of this person peppered around the island created a very captivating mystery. One that was deepened by the significance this person must have had. Lore was scoured over. Questions were asked. Theories were crafted, but the players could get no closer to solving the mystery of who this person was until more information could come out. Well, in January of 2022, Dead Cells received its third paid DLC pack, which finally unveiled this mysterious character to the masses and capped off a story that the developers had been building for years. The story of the Queen. Let's gather everything that's been teased about Her Majesty for the past few years, put it all in order, and tell the story of the Queen and the sea in its entirety, from its furtive beginnings to its unfortunate end. The island kingdom of the realm was a diverse country with a ton of landscapes that vary between creepy and horrific to elegant and breathtaking. The most spectacular of them all was High Peak Castle, where the king, atop his throne of stone, presided over this beautiful land. But it wasn't just him at the top. The king had a partner, his wife, the queen, who assisted with the royal rule of the country. Unlike her husband, who is well known to the populace of the realm, the queen was always wrapped in a veil of mystery, and rumors swirled about her origins. The most credible ones suggested she was associated with the pagan cult that resided in the Fractured Shrines, an area that the citizens of the realm were forbidden to travel to. But there was never anything concrete to confirm the rumors, so no one really knew exactly where she came from, nor did they know very much about her at all. The one thing that they did know about her was that she absolutely loved her husband, despite how selfish and hard-headed he could be at times, and recognized him as her king. The royal family of the realm was protected in High Peak Castle by the Royal Guard, who, led by their captain, the Giant, were dedicated to keeping the king and the queen safe. While the dedication of these soldiers was admirable, it was nothing like the utter devotion of the personal guard of the king and queen. His Highness had a bodyguard named the Hand of the King that deeply respected him and would easily give his life to protect him. And Her Majesty had not one guard, but three. A trio of women named Calliope, Euterpe, and Cleo. Although each of them was highly skilled with a specific weapon, and fierce fighters with extensive combat experience, individually, they weren't as powerful as the Hand or even the captain of the Royal Guard. But that's because their true strength lied in their amazing teamwork. When the three were fighting together as one team, they were nearly impossible to overcome and could protect the Queen as well as, or even better than the King's personal guard, giving credence to the saying that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. With the devotion of these troops backing them up, the king and the queen presided over an island kingdom that was quite prosperous. Given its proximity to the sea, most of the populace were skilled fishermen and sailors, and the trade they brought in from the ocean waves went a long way to enriching those that lived on the island. Trade that was made possible thanks to the illustrious lighthouse that stood on a small islet at the northern end of the realm. With its brilliant beacon, it helped guide ships and boats through the treacherous, rocky shoreline of the island's coast to arrive safely in Still Village. It was so important to the populace of the kingdom that it eventually became a status symbol of sorts, with some members of the aristocracy of the kingdom competing for certain areas of the coastline by the structure so they could be associated with the prestige of the lighthouse. Plus, having a beachside property to help with trade was pretty nice too. It was a necessary part of the maritime machine that made everything in the kingdom work. So when the king ordered the lighthouse extinguished over a strange scallop that washed up on its shore, there was concern from the populace. The lighthouse keepers weren't worried about the shelled object, but the king was, due to the building's proximity to the undying shores, a location that he had banished a bunch of heretical healers to, and where there were rumors of vile creatures seen on its shorelines. The king was concerned that this scallop could be some kind of experiment of the apostates of the undying shores, so until it was understood what it was, he ordered the beacon of the lighthouse extinguished and moved all of the keepers to Stilt Village. But before he could get the answers he was looking for, something else took precedence. The Malaise. The undead sickness swept through the land, decimating the population and killing everyone that came in contact with it. The king tried to get things under control, resorting to drastic, even cruel measures to try and stop the spread of the disease. But all of his efforts failed. The downfall of the kingdom was inevitable, and eventually, the king and the queen were infected by the Malaise, meaning the realm would be without its leaders and was doomed to crumble. However, one of the king's vassals, a man known as the Alchemist, after spending most of the time of the outbreak scouring the island to find some sort of way to cure or even just outlast the Malaise, found a possible solution. Ironically, it came from the very healers that the king had deemed criminals, the apostates of the undying shores. After being led to their home by soldiers that believed the heretics were the cause of the Malaise, the alchemist saw the apostates' amoral research and experiments with his own eyes, and was amazed by them. Two things in particular caught his attention: the creation of homunculi, artificial humans, by the apostates, and their research on strange blue cells, which seemed to be able to tap into the potential of life itself. Once the alchemist was handed one of these samples by one of the apostates, an idea came into his head. If he could find a way to create a homunculus, which could resist the Malaise thanks to its artificial nature, and imprint the soul of someone onto it, he would have found a way to outlast the disease and save the kingdom. He conducted an experiment to put his theory to the test, using the king as his subject. And although he had high hopes for its outcome, it didn't turn out the way he needed it to, ultimately deeming it a failure. However, while it was a failure for him, it wasn't necessarily a failure for the apostates, who were always looking to explore life and death in more detail, even if it meant breaking a few moral rules to do so. They performed a homunculus experiment of their own, using the queen as their test subject, and the results of their experiment differed from the alchemists. Just like the king, the queen became a homunculus, but unlike her husband, the queen retained all of her memories as well as control of her old body, meaning the apostates had been able to achieve what the alchemist dreamed of and had found a way to endure the Malaise and hope for the kingdom. That hope, however, was short-lived, as the work the apostates did on the queen wasn't exactly consensual, and as a result, her personal guard, after hearing what was happening to the queen, quickly gathered their weapons and rushed to the testing room, where they killed all of the apostates within and released the queen. While they had saved Her Majesty, they had also killed the only ones that knew how to create a functional homunculus. And without their knowledge, the realm was doomed to eventually succumb to the ravages of the Malaise. The weight of what they'd done weighed heavy on their shoulders. But instead of being consumed by the inevitability of their demise, the queen and her servants, recognizing that this didn't need to be an end for them, picked themselves up from the depths of their hopelessness and set off to figure out what good they could still do for the realm. While the Queen had been given a way to outlast the Malaise thanks to the amoral, forbidden experiments of the apostates, the regular people of the realm had no such luxury. Their choices were either to wait around until they died a horrid, sickly death at the hands of the Malaise, or to suffer under the king's strict pandemic measures until they were killed by one of those. Neither one of these choices were very appealing to the populace, so they decided to create a new one for themselves: escape. Climbing aboard the ships and boats they used for fishing, passage, and trading, they tried to flee their doomed homeland. But the journey was treacherous and dangerous, not only due to the monsters that roamed the land, but because the beacon of the lighthouse was still extinguished, meaning the people ran a huge risk of crashing into the sharp stones of the rocky shoreline of the island. Unfortunately, this was the fate of many of the vessels that attempted to flee, and as the wrecks piled up, it left a graveyard of ships around the structure that was meant to save them from this watery grave. Ships that were filled with the corpses of those that had hoped to escape certain death on land, and instead met their end on the sea. Not every ship succumbed to this fate though, as some sailors were able to dodge the rocks near the island and head for open water. But inexplicably, just as they passed the lighthouse, they too would sink. Wanting to find out why even the ships that made it past the rocks were sinking, some people from Stilt Village made the treacherous journey to the forsaken lighthouse, hoping they could find out what was going on, or at the very least, light the beacon so that their chances of escape were better. And when they finally came upon the building, they were greeted by something unexpected: the Queen and her personal guard. After killing the apostates and destroying the only hope the realm had at outlasting the Malaise, they knew that saving the realm was impossible, as nothing was going to be able to stop the disease. But they also knew that there was still some good that they could do. While their home was destroyed by the horrible disease, they could work to ensure that it was the only victim, that the Malaise never spread beyond the shores of the realm, and that the wider world would never have to suffer at its hands. Motivated by their new purpose, they stationed themselves at the lighthouse and did anything and everything to prevent the Malaise from spreading beyond the realm. They kept the lighthouse beacon extinguished. They killed those that came to try and light it. And they sank any vessels that tried to escape. Sacrificed the few to save the many. A motto they told themselves to ease the pain they faced as they took an eternal vigil to trap the people of the realm in their doomed homeland. Among those trapped on the island was the Beheaded, the homunculus version of the king, who was happily fighting the monsters of the Malaise in an endless cycle of death and reanimation. One day, when he was about to start a new run through the remnants of the kingdom, a tentacle delivered a note to the Beheaded. Apparently, someone who was sick of being trapped on the island had noticed his repeated runs through it, and figuring he wanted to get out as bad as they did, asked the Beheaded to meet them in the sewers where they could talk about escape. It wasn't much later that the Beheaded met the writer of the note, a portly, tentacled creature known as the Fisherman, in the sewers munching on some fish. The Fisherman told the Beheaded that while looking for a ship to escape on, he noticed the lighthouse at the northern end of the island. Figuring it was their best bet at getting off this godforsaken rock, he asked for the Beheaded's help in getting to it and lighting the beacon, not willing to make the journey himself due to the monsters that were guaranteed to be infesting the shipwrecks at its base. The Beheaded turned to leave, but the Fisherman stopped him and told him to visit one of the old lighthouse keepers' homes in Stilt Village, figuring he would probably have something that would help them reach the building. Indeed, when the Beheaded found the home of the keeper, he discovered a crowned key on his body, which opened a door by the castle that led to a pier where the Fisherman was waiting. The two set sail, and the Beheaded was dropped off at the infested shipwreck at the foot of the lighthouse, where he found not only the Malaise-ridden bodies of those that died in the sinkings, but also strange armored creatures clambering in the halls. He had encountered these monstrosities once before, in the home of the lighthouse keeper, where he met a large one that immediately attacked him upon seeing him, and a smaller one that saw him as its parent and jumped into his arms. An interesting thing he noticed about these creatures was that they didn't seem to be monsters created by the Malaise, but looked to be organisms that had a life cycle of their own, as there were eggs in the keeper's home, and the smaller creature that burst from the corpse of the dead keeper would grow into a larger one if it fed on enough flesh. His mind then turned to the strange scallop mentioned in the keeper's journal. And then he understood why the king would be nervous about something like that washing up on the shores of the realm. The Beheaded continued on, making it through the infested shipwreck until finally coming to the lighthouse. As he stepped inside, a lit chandelier fell to the ground and started a fire. And that's when he noticed Calliope, who launched an attack on the Beheaded, determined to fulfill the duty she and her friends assigned themselves so long ago. At the same time, the fire set by the falling chandelier gained momentum and started rising through the lighthouse, requiring the Beheaded to dodge Calliope's attacks while also running away from the climbing flames. While it had its dangers, the climb wasn't too bad. That is until the Beheaded encountered Euterpe partway up the building, who joined in her friend's chase of the trespasser. Euterpe's attacks added a lot more stress to the Beheaded's climb, but he still managed to make his way up, although with some difficulty. And that's when he saw Cleo lounging on a balcony. She, of course, joined the fray, making the Beheaded's climb utterly frantic. With the heat of the ascending flames at his heels, he clambered up ladders and vines, smashed through wooden beams, and swung up old pulleys, all while avoiding being shot, smashed, or sliced to death. Somehow, he made it near the top, whereupon the three met him in a chamber where they intended to stop him once and for all. They then launched the full extent of their power upon the Beheaded, dropping in where the last left off to continue a relentless assault, doing combo attacks to push the Beheaded on his heels, and showing why they were chosen to be the guardians of the Queen. Any other foe would have surely fell before their might, but the Beheaded was something else. Somehow he was able to dodge or block their attacks and whittle them down until, one by one, he eliminated Calliope, Euterpe, and Cleo, and cleared the way to the pinnacle of the lighthouse. As he reached the top, so too did the flames of the fire he started at the building's base. He was moments away from relighting the beacon of the lighthouse, and perhaps signaling a ship out in the ocean to come and rescue him from the endless cycle of death that was life on the island. But there was still one final test for him to overcome. His wife, the Queen. If the king appeared to her in his homunculus form, the Queen would only see him as an interloper that needed to be stopped. But if he approached her after reclaiming his body and curing it with the panacea, she would recognize him as her husband. Despite still harboring some feelings of love for him, the Queen's resolve was absolute, and believing that he was only here to save himself, not use his condition to try and find a cure for anyone else, she vowed to stop him. The two then engaged in a brutal fight for survival atop the lighthouse, each adapting their strategy according to the tactics of the other. As the fight wore on, the Queen unveiled a power that seemed to imply she had some kind of control over reality and time. She would float in the air, and cuts from her blade would rain down on the king. But the ones that happened in the past would still occur even as new ones came in, which built a web of danger that the king would have to watch out for. Despite this power, the king managed to push the Queen to the brink, where in a final desperate measure to come out the victor, the Queen covered the whole peak with her reality red, But the king was able to beat her down before she could launch this final attack. On her knees, defeated, the queen let out one final curse to the cause of the downfall of everything she and her husband loved, and accepted her fate. The king stood over her, then kicked her from the pinnacle of the lighthouse to be consumed by the flames below. Feeding off her power, the lighthouse blazed in an illuminating light. As the sun rose, the king saw a ship on the horizon. He waved it down, but as it came closer, to his horror, he saw that it was completely filled with undead, seemingly implying that the queen's self-appointed mission was all for naught. His hopes in salvation and rescue dashed. The beheaded slinked back to the prisoners' quarters to begin the cycle anew, which brings an end to the story of the Queen and the Sea. This new DLC pack went a long way to answering some of our outstanding questions on the world of Dead Cells, but at the same time, it still left plenty outstanding. What did the undead on the ship in the ending mean? That the Malaise has already made its way out of the realm? Or that it came from outside of it to begin with? The Queen seems to have some control over reality and time, as does the Timekeeper who resides in the clock tower. Are these two related somehow? How did the Queen of the Pagans, whose people were hated by the king and the citizens of the kingdom, end up marrying the king and becoming queen of the realm? Luckily, despite this DLC pack containing a new ending, seemingly implying that this could be the end of the story, Evil Empire and Motion Twin have hinted that there will be more content in the future. So hopefully, these questions can be answered in some follow-up releases for the game. What these future releases could contain is anyone's guess, but the developers have been making some hints that suggest that the story could take a more cosmic focus in the future. There's always been vague references to the ancients or the gods in Dead Cells. Some of the level blurbs in the Fractured Shrines and Slumbering Sanctuary, as well as the warning message that comes up when the beheaded opens a cursed chest, are good examples. And one of the level blurbs for the infested shipwreck makes these references much more interesting now. It seems to be a bunch of gibberish, but it's actually a reference to a chant uttered by priests of Cthulhu in H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos that foretells the return of the god. According to those that speak it, the Lovecraft chant is translated as this: "In his house at Erlier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming." The chant in Dead Cells is essentially the same, but with two words switched out, giving the new translation of, "In his house at Debor, dead Staffy waits dreaming." If the same logic that is applied to the Cthulhu chant is applied here, then this chant must foretell the return of a god named Staffy, who currently rests at a city named Debor. But what makes this quote really interesting is that the name of the god in the chant is constructed around the word staff, which is also the shortened form of Staphylococcus, which is a type of bacteria that can cause an infection when it enters the body, which sounds pretty similar to something that's happening in the realm. Could this mean that the Malaise is a type of staph infection that is being caused by the Staffy god? If so, why was the realm targeted? By chance, or was it deliberate? Which brings up another interesting thing about the quote. In the Lovecraft stories, Erlier is described as an incomprehensible city out in the middle of the ocean that seems to uncomfortably change your perception of it as you're looking at it, where things can be flat and diagonal, where up can also be left. While not exactly the same, the changing geometry of Erlier echoes the constantly shifting landscapes of the realm, which begs the question, could the realm be Debor? The city where Staffy, a great old one, prophesies to return sleeps? If so, is that why the Malaise emerged here? Because that's a power of Staffy? Could it be a sign that his return is imminent? These questions just breed more. Could Staffy be the god that the pagan cult out on the Fractured Shrines worships? If so, did the queen know about it? Could she be trying to protect the wider world from more than just the Malaise? Could the vile creatures mentioned in the Undying Shores and the armored shrimps seen in the infested shipwreck be monsters from Debor? Could the ancient artifacts the apostates are messing with have come from the nightmarish city? Are we gonna get a DLC pack where we fight a literal god? Unfortunately, we'll have to wait for more details to emerge about the world of Dead Cells before we can have the answers to these questions, if we ever get them at all. But it's incredibly exciting to think about the possibilities. Now, I think that's everything for the Queen and the Sea DLC, but if I missed anything, feel free to point it out and share your thoughts. I'll be happy to hear from you. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them. But until next time, thank you for watching and see you later. The Beheaded turned to leave, but the fisherman stopped him and told him to visit one of the old lighthouse keeper. Come on, ugh.